All right, good day, anyone watching. My name is Emilio Englade. This is my little humble proposal of why David Foster Wallace is such an engaging and memorable writer. Sorry for having to read this, but that's just the way I float. So, the title is Classical Wallace, Recursive Reader. The unique thing about reading David Foster Wallace to me as a copy editor is that he helps me better understand my job as a professional reader. In this paper, I aim to illustrate what I mean by this statement through reading a deceptively simple story. Here it is. Say, yeah. Yes, indeed. A radically condensed history of post-industrial life, page 0 of brief interviews. A mere 5 sentences split between 2 paragraphs. I will use it to describe reading as an iterative, recursive process in which similar operations interact at different levels to make a text meaningful. But before we get to those arguments, you'll need to have in mind a fundamental point. Note that on the page, Wallace's story does not look so different from this. Whoops, back up. There we go. Does not look so different from this, the printer's standard dummy text used for layout from the early days of printing. The text was created from Ciceronian Latin, fucked with so it's no longer quite Latin anymore, for a particular purpose, to retain the general look of words without offering the viewer the temptation of trying to read them. The letter frequencies and lengths of the words are similar to those we find in English, but with the fundamental difference that the letters do not combine to form interpretable sentences in either Latin or English. This opaque text makes a point that underlies everything I will be talking about here. Although the words of a text are important to the readers for the meaning they convey, when arranged on a page, they are a material that readers must process at multiple levels to extract that meaning. Wallace was more attuned than many at with this materiality of language, so much so that I will argue that by attending to the effects of the visible words on the reading experience, he would structure his sentences to tap the dynamics of reading itself for thematic effect. As an entry to the processes I will discuss, let's do something radical here. I will pause for a few seconds, during which I invite you to read through Wallace's story. Since the meat of this presentation will involve reading this text sentence by sentence, it will be helpful if you have your own experience of reading the story fresh in mind. And here we go. All right, I hope you're done. Some of you may have previously seen me describe one example of Wallace's intensive focus on language by deliberately misspelling words that Don Gately speaks in Infinite Jest. He gives readers not simply an external sense of how it would be to interact with Don, but an actual sense of Don's psychology, that this is how he would actually spell those words. With this paper, I will consider how Wallace taps the dynamics of reading for thematic effect, at levels beyond that isolated example. The vital link for making this argument will be the work of Wolfgang Iser, who in the late 1970s laid out a theory of what actually happens as readers interact with literature. He describes reading as a serial process where readers gradually encounter a range of character perspectives. By comparing and synthesizing those perspectives, the reader builds a model or schema of the story that continues to develop until the story's conclusion. The reader thus uses the encounter with different points of view as a guide to realize the story itself, which evolves with the reader's understanding of it. I will argue that Wallace shapes his text to perturb this schema-building process, obliging readers to engage with the text in unusual, non-linear ways. The text thus becomes a sort of puzzle in which surprising conjunctions suddenly become visible with each new connection discovered. I suspect every Wallace fan has felt this thrill of new discovery from his work. My argument here is that we learn to seek it so intuitively because it builds recursively on the machinery we have already developed over a lifetime of reading. In reading our Wallace micro-story, I will describe 4 interlocking levels. All right. at each of which the mind puts a different array of components in relation to each other. Similar processes of fragmentation and reconnection work recursively at the different levels, gradually building the words of the text into a story the reader experiences. Decoding begins at the sentence level, with the need to distinguish subject, verb, object to produce a meaningful statement. The next sentence is then read in relation to the previous one, with a difference. This is the discourse level, where sentences combine to form a coherent situation. As we have seen, Easer describes a similar process at the narrative level, where the reader draws information from the different perspectives in a scene, and each new scene modifies the understanding of all that has gone before. I conclude by arguing that Wallace takes the synthesizing process one step further to a fourth textual level, at which the reader's attempts to provide structure to an unruly text result in new and surprising connections forming. I hope you'll find the journey exhilarating, full of surprising convergences. For any story, reading begins with processing the first sentence. Since the advent of the computer, much research has gone into what the eye actually does as we read, as evidence for how our minds interpret the sensory input. Using a radically condensed history as an example, the results look something like this. And here's a replay. Okay. So this is a crude approximation, but you get the gist. Attention moves like a kind of spotlight over the sentence, focusing on one word at a time, while hazier information is available about the words on either side. Each word receives individual attention to isolate its meaning from isolate its meaning and is put in relation to the next word and the next and the next and the next. Based on an inner template of what a sentence looks like, somewhere there will be a subject which will act by means of a verb, possibly on an object. The mind pieces together the words, separates them into the sentence's components, and assembles the model of how the different pieces interact with each other. When we reach the final period, this model is capped off, completing the impression of what happens in that sentence. Thus, note that even at the scale of interpreting a single sentence, reading is a process of fragmentation and recombination. An array of individual words have to be classified into their functional categories and arranged in a web of relationships to yield the content of the sentence. To those of us of a certain age, this may bring to mind the sentence diagrams we sometimes had to make in school, in which all the words would be arranged in a frame. The words became a visual object that generally seemed more complex and vastly less meaningful than the sentence itself. For instance, let's look at the first sentence of our story in this very different form. Here we see subject, verb, object arranged on the top line with various words and phrases dangling from the words they modify. The comparative inaccessibility of the sentence's meaning in this format is beneficial here, for it shows the relational complexity hidden beneath the words on the page. This level of detail may not be present to our conscious minds, but it must be there under the hood as we interpret even this fairly simple sentence. Reading that seems effortless, in other words, has a great deal of relational work built in. Then we do the same work for the next sentence, with a twist. This is where Easer comes in. As we start to form the model for the second sentence, we do so in light of what we know from the first one. To use Easer's terminology, the theme of each sentence emerges against the horizon of the previous ones. This has both forward and backward-facing effects. The new information adds to the store of what we have learned about the situation, but it also changes how we understand the previous material. In studies of reading, this is often called the discourse level. In my terms, it is where the reader starts developing a story's schema of the different scenes, who is involved, and what's happening. In the case of our particular story, the schema starts to emerge before the characters do, in the opening phrase, when they were introduced. The paragraph sketches what happens as two people are introduced, perhaps at a party. He makes a joke, and she laughs hard, playing separate roles but explicitly united in their hoping to be liked. It's significant that these are not named characters, but simply pronouns, one male and one female. For story purposes, they are their roles, illustrating two sides of a seemingly universal anxiety not to be alone. This outline of a situation carries a potentially immense emotional charge, because those simple pronouns also face out toward the reader. They act like the clean outline forms of the lead character of a comic, which are often contrasted with the more detailed profiles of the secondary characters we are not meant to identify with. Think of the contrast between the simple pointy mouse faces of the protagonists of Mouse and the craggier faces of the Nazi cats that chase them. In Understanding Comics, Scott McCloud argues that the readers identify with the main characters in part because of the simple forms, filling the blank space within the lines with the reader's own emotional involvement. In much the same way, the pronouns here leave ample space for remembering parallel situations from the reader's own life and for filling in the character's emotions with the reader's own. This is especially true once we get to the third sentence up there, designed to release all that pent-up feeling. The characters drive home, still alone and becoming more separated than ever, yet still also entangled, the very same twist to their faces. The process of schema formation doesn't stop at the end of the scene, though. The schema continues to evolve, eventually encompassing the whole narrative and all of the nuances of the reader's experience. This is the higher level version of the scene building process, but where individual sentences have greater weight at the scene level, more global perspectives become dominant at this new narrative level. These perspectives are just what you would expect, the various points of view the reader encounters. We've already encountered three in our first paragraph: he, she, and the narrator, who describes their experience. When we compare their perspectives, they are remarkably consistent, all focused on loneliness and the somewhat desperate desire to avoid it. This consistency makes the first paragraph a skeletal frame for holding all the reader's own social anxieties, so the reader can identify all the better with the characters and the raw emotion of their situation. In the next sentence, however, we find a new perspective, one that looks critically over all we've just experienced. Here we have a character explicitly looking at and judging the former pair's struggle to communicate, inviting us to do the same. Overall, the couple comes off far better than this new man, their sincere desire to please, providing sharp contrast to his more cynical acting, anxious as he was to preserve good relations at all times. The keynote continues to be anxiety, but this man suffers from a more acute and self-isolating variety. Deliberately, he places himself outside their shared experience of isolation, marked on the page by his position in a new backward-facing paragraph. This contrast also seems significant, where the anxious couple move consistently forward through the events of their evening. This man only looks back. Even textually, he seems to have no life of his own, save what he has invested in keeping tabs on others. His thoroughly isolated position gives readers the perfect location to recognize for themselves both the need for sincere communication and the complex performative dynamics through which we try to express ourselves. But the story still has one sentence left, the one I find most typical of 1990s Wallace. Throughout this argument, I've indicated how the structure of Wallace's sentences on the page both echoes and in part expresses the themes of the story. So far, however, that experience has been classically linear, the perspectives well-ordered and working together to guide us through ongoing events. The themes and emotions have been different, but the reading process itself has not been far from that of a thriller, in which events move constantly forward, and periodically you encounter a surprise that leads you to reconsider what you thought you knew before. In other words, our understanding of the story has recapitulated the linear task of decoding the text, with each new piece of information helping build the story in our heads. This, by the way, may explain why detective stories make such compelling reading. What is any story but a quest to discover the truth? And when the characters themselves are involved in such a quest, it is an invitation to loop the machinery we are already using into a larger network, so the discoveries at the sentence and plot levels can reinforce each other. Where Wallace excels, however, is in arranging words to kick us out of this comfortable reading process, sending us more intensively back on the text to solve the riddle a new set of words poses. Traditionally, such redirecting of attention to the text has been called metatextual, but in Wallace's case, I prefer to call it simply textual, for the reason that he doesn't take us beyond the narrative, but more solidly into it by making us consider our work as readers. With Wallace, form very deliberately follows function. Because the structure of the language on the page helps express a story's themes, throwing us consciously back onto that structure is an invitation to become more expansive in the ways that we consider the text and the experience we take away from it. In the case of this story, the final sentence stands out from all the previous ones. Each of those earlier sentences had a subject that clearly identified who the actor in the sentence would be: he, she, each, the man. In the final sentence, however, who is this one who speaks? The simplest reading is that this is the man's internal monologue. Initially, this seems appealing. It feels natural that we would segue from a description of his inner state to his thoughts themselves, and those thoughts fit quite well with the anxiety just described. However, this is the only inner monologue that we've been privy to in the story, so the sentence still carries a charge of intimacy that sets it apart from the preceding ones. Restricting the words to the man's head begins to seem less certain when we get to the incantatory repetition, "Now did one, now did one, now did one." These could be that stuck man's thoughts, showing the obsessive loop of his fears, but the sheer repetition heightens awareness of the words themselves, especially of that slippery pronoun one. Combined with the sentence's surprising intimacy, this seems to point the words ever more insistently toward the reader. Perhaps they are an accusation, highlighting our involvement with the stymied lovers in the first paragraph, insisting that we are no different from the characters in the story. And still, there is that one, which might not even always refer to the same person. It seems significant, for instance, that the pronoun is repeated 3 times, once for each of the characters. Perhaps part of the satisfying finality of those repetitions is that they walk us step by step backward, from the man to her to him, to that first moment of introduction for the reader as well as for the characters. The almost explicit question of whether anything distinguishes us from those characters is disturbing. This lingering disturbance may be the story's most lasting residue. So, which is the correct reading of that last sentence? All of them, and likely more besides. By posing the simple question of who is speaking and providing no definitive answer, the line throws us back on the evaluation of perspectives at the heart of interpreting any story. Such open-ended final words are a hallmark of Wallace's writing in the 90s. This is just one of several examples in brief interviews alone. These endings provide the opposite of closure by transforming what had seemed one story into many. That is to say, even though the events of the story follow a linear trajectory, the ending leaves the reader's schema unresolved, not susceptible of any single interpretation. We are left as unsatisfied as any of the characters, here drawing one final parallel between our destiny and theirs. This is what I mean by the claim that Wallace uses the dynamics of the reading experience for thematic effect. Our processing of the words in part replicates the characters' experiences, drawing the characters as much into our mental world as we are temporarily drawn into theirs. As a closing thought, I leave you with Easer's powerful description of Beckett's writing. His fictional texts enable us to understand what fiction is, and herein lies the subtle appeal of his achievement. I've argued today that these words apply equally well to David Foster Wallace. I hope this discussion of the different levels at which Wallace shaped his text has left you in a better position to understand why. Thank you all, and God bless. All right.